Thank you all for joining us today. My name is David Durand-Delacre. I'm a researcher based in Bonn, Germany, working for the UN University Institute for Environment and Human Security, specifically the Environment and Migration Division. I'm glad to welcome you today for an hour or a little bit more of presentation and discussion of an upcoming report that we wrote for the Climate Justice Resilience Fund. We reviewed some of the grants that they issued in the past 7 years on projects to address the needs of communities around the world experiencing different forms of climate-related migration, displacement, relocation. Today, I'll present some of the results of the upcoming report, and then we'll be joined in conversation with the director of CJRF, Heather McGray, as well as Salote Soko, who's director of advocacy at UUSC. We may also be joined by a third person, Max Neal, but unfortunately he hasn't been able to confirm. It seems to have had some last-minute trouble. Also, I shared a link with my colleague Karuki, who has just joined us. I'm going to send you into the participants, Karuki. If I can, if you could turn off your video as well. Sorry about that. Well, I'll just leave it like this. Okay, so thank you for joining us today. Just a couple of points of logistics. We'll take questions through the Q&A function of the webinar, so please don't hesitate to list your questions there. Also, if you'd like to introduce yourselves to other attendees and to us in the chat, don't hesitate to do so. We'll have definitely time to answer as many of your questions as we can. So I look forward to hearing what interests you from what is discussed in the first 2/3 of the meeting. And I'll just go straight into my presentation of the upcoming report. I'll be sharing some of the high-level messages with a few examples of the grants that were funded and some of the lessons that emerged from that. And once we have done that, we can go into more depth with our panelists. So just a little bit of background on what we did. We were asked by CJRF, who is a re-grantor of pooled funds that was founded in 2016, to review the portion of their grant portfolio, which includes over 40 different grants, that addresses climate mobilities. So 11 of those grants were included. These cover 3 areas around the world, specifically Alaska, Bangladesh, and various Pacific islands. Just a little piece of context, the word climate mobilities, I think we use it quite often in academic environments, but the intent behind it is to capture the full breadth of movement under climate change, and it incorporates essentially 4 types, various types of which we've covered in the report. So some of the movements that we'll talk about are more like migration, which is typically more voluntary. Others more displacement, which is more forced. Also planned relocation, which is more collective, more organized and planned. And then also, importantly, immobility, which can be divided into 2 types between voluntary and voluntary immobility. People who aspire to move but are not able to, and others who may face displacement but are resisting this. So my apologies, I think that I shared the link with a couple of colleagues who all seem to have joined. If you could please rename yourselves or leave the panelist list, that would be great. And join us as participants. That would be good. The purpose of our reports was not to evaluate or assess the grants that in the CJRF portfolio, but rather to, in the review of all of the documentation and in conversation with the grant partners and the project managers who did these projects, to draw out some of the key lessons and recommendations that could be of relevance to CJRF, but also to other philanthropic funders and international policy advocates. And we focused on 4 themes: climate mobility projects, the activities essentially that were carried out to address these various forms of climate mobility, but also the ways in which grant partners engaged directly with affected people, how they involved them in movement building and also promoted their leadership and decision making. We also were interested in what makes an effective grant on this theme, and touched on the relationship between climate mobilities and loss and damage. I'll go straight into the inventory of activities that we identified, and I'll talk about them in 3 sort of blocks. I won't go into the full detail here of these tables, which there'll be lots of examples in the reports that will be shared with you once it's published. But there are some sort of general points to make. Under displacement-related activities, we observed that essentially a lot of the work could be divided between, on the first instance, immediate rehabilitation, so work that was there to provide supports to people facing displacement and responding to the emergencies that they face, and then also work that tried to extend this into the longer term to ensure that such displacement will not happen again, and to do so with longer term livelihood and resilience measures. One example of this is work that USC does, and we can talk about it with Stavote in much more detail, but just to say, some of these basic needs included in the projects included things like water security, food security, ensuring that people have access to these basic things. And importantly, I want to highlight it already, there was a lot of work involved there to ensure that, convening the communities and really understanding their needs, and this work sort of arose from these consultations. The second big block of work in terms of climate mobilities is that to support relocating communities. And there we can make a distinction between 3 types of activities that are basically dependent on what time the project happens in relation to the relocation. The first line in this table is all activities that are done before. Relocations are often very complicated, they're complex processes, and communities often do not have the resources to put them in place when they desire relocation. And so some of the projects, particularly in Alaska, have worked very hard with communities to help them build the capacity and implement also sort of the advocacy work that they need to get the help that's necessary to relocate. In some other cases, relocation was actually implemented, so the physical movement of people, and this was usually on a small scale. There's a case I'll talk about in a minute in Bangladesh, and there was actual work of purchasing land, building houses, but also ensuring that the people, the families that were being relocated obtained all of the other necessary conditions, sort of supports, so that their conditions of life in their new homes was possible. So again, basic needs to services, but also connections with local government programs, for example, reschooling their children, and as well also help in engaging with their new neighbors, the host community in the area where they were relocated to. And finally, and this is, I think, also interesting to really highlight, is work that was done with people who had already been relocated or were in the process of relocating. And the interventions in these projects were more about helping people cope with the impact that this can have on them, because relocations are often difficult processes and they have often negative impacts, especially when they're not finished. So there are some cases where communities are split because the relocation is lasting a really long time. And we also talked to a sub-grant partner working with USC, where they are dealing on Rabi Island in Fiji, with a historical relocation to this site, which has left many marks on that community, both in terms of essential services, but also in the way it has affected their culture. So as I mentioned, IPSA, Young Power and Social Action in Bangladesh, is one of the examples that we talk about in the reports, where they've done a lot of the work in this middle section of actually facilitating the relocation. And I just want to highlight that again, one of the really important aspects of this was in building community teams that could also help them ensure that all of the measures they were taking were the right ones. Finally, and this is perhaps a little broader, but our projects that are focused on migration and immobility. And we put these together because really the center of this work is in enabling people to choose the right path for them, whether they decide that migration is the right path for them or staying where they are. And in this case, one of the more sort of prominent examples that can help sort of understand how this works is the migration information hubs that Habitat Bangladesh put into place. And there, the focus was on disseminating the right kind of information so that people would be aware of the different opportunities that would be available to them if they migrated, but also some of the risks. There are, for example, labor abuses in certain parts of Bangladesh that they should be aware of before going. And at the same time, also providing them with the skills, new job opportunities that they could either use in the local sort of job market, but also if they preferred to go and use to seek jobs elsewhere in the country. So here really the focus being on enabling choice. Based on this, we also sort of came up with some more general principles, more so perhaps sort of value-based approaches that people or the grant partners shared with us is particularly important. And the first one, I think, is an important reminder that we heard from virtually everyone, is that although we're really talking about mobilities that are caused or attributable to a climate hazard, cyclones or floods or salinization, maybe longer-term processes of drought or erosion, just as prominent in the reasons for having to move or facing displacement are also colonial histories, development histories, and ongoing socioeconomic inequalities, which is why all of the partners have, and this is what CJRF started up to do, essentially, is have adopted a human rights and a climate justice lens. And we can talk about the panel maybe a little bit about what it means to apply such a lens to climate mobility work. Something that was also quite prominent is that although these projects are focused on people who have experienced, for example, displacement or are considering relocation or migration, a lot of the people who are involved and who are consulted and they benefit from the project are not defined by their mobility status. A lot of the time, there are also people who prefer to stay and also get support through the projects. And there are also people who, for example, like host communities, also need to be involved in the process and the project. And finally, and this was the point about migration, really the focus is on reducing vulnerabilities and really enabling choice. There is no outside actor who can decide that one form of mobility or another is desirable for people, and it's the focus really is on enabling them to choose what's the best path forward. I've made a lot of emphasis on community engagement and leadership, and this was one of the major aspects that we discussed also with grant partners. And on this, we have a few more recommendations, and the first one is really the involvement of community members at all project stages. So ideally as early as possible, and even more importantly, in ways that really allow them to make decisions and to take ownership of some of the decision making. So it's not just about consulting people, but also about creating conditions so local people can take on responsibilities and have the right support to do it. So this would be things like hiring local staff and letting people, for example, in Alaska, decide who should be hired to do the work. In Alaska Native tribes, that's common. In Bangladesh, community groups were created, members of the community who would then really drive a lot of the decision making, for example, with the relocation in terms of prioritizing and who in the community is the most vulnerable and should get relocated first. The third point here is also very much that the focus has to be on providing technical assistance and training, or what's also known as just the capacity building. groups, giving ownership to this. Once people look at all of the decisions they have to make, they often request very specific assistance and training. And so that has been a big focus of many of the projects. So just a couple more examples on this. For example, in Alaska, the Alaska Institute for Justice supported the incorporation of a local indigenous concept, USTEC, which combines erosion, flooding, and permafrost melting into a single sort of metric for threat assessment, and then also assisted the communities in getting this concept into statewide disaster risk management policies. And the effect of this is really to better reflect the reality of communities as they experience it, and it also has allowed them to get data that it was also then very useful for them to make funding applications to get the support they need in the face of climate hazards. The Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium also, to provide another example, organized the peer review of some of their recommendations in this report, the unmet needs report, and found that in this process of giving space for tribal members to review this work, not only did it improve the report, but it also provided them with a tool that they could then use in their own advocacy with federal agencies. Now I'll just say a few words about sort of effective grant making, essentially what is a good grant for the purposes that we've been discussing. And these are relatively sort of high-level points, but I think they're the ones that across the board people mentioned. And we can go in discussion during the panel a little bit about what they mean and some more examples. But most prominent, and this word came up again and again, is flexibility. And this was something that we discussed a lot in relationship to the grants that CJRF provides. But the idea is that a lot of the problems faced and the challenges faced by people who are displaced or particularly vulnerable because of their mobilities means that the projects have to evolve. And this means flexibility in terms not only of goals and activities. One example is Habitas Bangladesh shifting some of their trainings away from sort of group skills training into apprenticeship models, for example, though that was not what they had initially planned, but also this has budget and timeline implications. Long grants were very often desired, particularly because these allow relationship building, and there was a big emphasis on the fact that a lot of the challenges that are faced here are really long-term challenges. And finally, there was also some discussion, and we can talk about this also in the panel, about reporting requirements and trust-based reporting. The idea that, especially for shorter grants, the weight of reporting can be quite overwhelming, especially when the money goes to the smaller community-based organizations. And so adopting reporting requirements that are flexible and what have you was deemed particularly important. And instead, the request was very often for, instead of sort of focus on reporting, more on creating opportunities to exchange and to learn from each other, including between different projects. Finally, and I'll conclude on this theme before we move on to the panel, we also asked some questions about climate mobilities and loss and damage. So before anything, I should say that only 2 of the grants that we reviewed were explicitly formulated and designed with loss and damage in mind, and those are some of the more recent grants from 2022 onwards. But still, we decided to inquire about this because this is a growing area of concern. There have been discussions ongoing about the new fund for responding to loss and damage, which was recently discussed at a second board meeting. And although not all partners thought that this sort of international conversation was relevant to their context, they nonetheless had some important lessons to share, and I'll try to summarize them here for you. But before I do that, I also want to say that climate mobilities can be understood, and this is still something, an area of debate, but they can be understood in more or less 4 ways. They can be the results of losses and damages. So, for example, displacement can happen as a result of climate impacts. But the experience of relocating or moving in itself can be a loss and damage. So For example, I mentioned partial relocations that split communities, and then that's the very process of relocating can drive losses. And then there's also, then I distinguish this with climate mobilities as a driver of loss and damage, which is when people find themselves having completed their movement, their migration, their relocation into a new area where they face new risks, new damages. And then in the best case scenario, and this is what a lot of the projects aim to do by enabling choice, enabling and supporting people in various ways, is to avoid them. And mobility can be, though not always, a part of that. So finally, just the lessons that we learned on this topic. There's still a lot of uncertainty about exactly what losses and damages people are experiencing, especially the non-economic ones. People don't necessarily speak in terms of that language or use that language to describe their experiences. But it's nonetheless useful to have these conversations and open these spaces for them to identify whether or not they want to adopt it and whether or not it might open some funding and advocacy opportunities. Something that came up quite frequently as well is that there is this increasing distinction in international discussions between economic and non-economic losses and damages, but they don't always make sense in practice. And a lot of the interventions that people put into place, that the partners put into place, kind of combine both simultaneously. So just to think of one example in Bangladesh, people who have lost their sources of income also, by extension, tend to lose social status and the ability, for example, to fund things like their cultural rituals and so on. So providing new sources of livelihoods, new, more sustainable ways of gaining income is also a way of addressing non-economic loss and damages, even if indirectly. And finally, approaching this topic requires a great deal of care because there is a lot of grief involved and a lot of trauma often. And so some of the grant partners really emphasize that funders and other external people who wish to bring this topic to local communities should do this with support from professionals and people knowledgeable about this to establish whether or not that's the way, whether and how to approach it. So I'll conclude on that, and I'll invite our panelists to turn on their camera. So that we can start a conversation. Thank you, Heather, for joining, and Salote. I'll just take a quick logistical moment to see if I can hide. Yeah, I'll hide our non-video participants. There we go. So that's better for the people who join us. And I'll also stop sharing my screen. Okay. So inviting you now, I think before anything, I have a number of questions on specific themes that for you, but maybe to start, I'd be interested in hearing from Heather and then from Salote, if you have any sort of key headline message that you would already like to communicate in reaction to what I've presented, or on this general theme of funding for addressing climate mobilities. Maybe Heather, we can start with you if you have a brief statement to make, and then hand over directly to Salote.
Sure. Thanks very much, David, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. The Climate Justice Resilience Fund really was, I guess, on the leading edge of this issue of climate mobilities when we got started in 2016. There weren't many philanthropic funders, for sure, really paying attention to what climate change means for mobility and what that means for people's lives and livelihoods. We come to this issue with a climate justice mandate, and this is really focusing first and foremost on bringing human rights and people's lived experience, people's needs and priorities to the center of the climate agenda. And this kind of climate justice approach, I think, sheds light on the need to pay attention to how climate change matters for mobility. And over the last 7 years, we've really seen a huge change. There's much more attention, not just in academia any longer, also in the funding space and in the policy space at a range of different levels, to how climate change matters for people, how climate change matters for people's rights, and their lives and their livelihoods. And this includes attention to mobility and a range of different types of mobility. So we're really pleased to have this opportunity to look back at the work we've supported under this component of our initial strategy. And then we can talk a little bit later the relevance for this work to the loss and damage agenda, where we now have a significant new portfolio, and particularly to this concept of non-economic loss and damage, where there's a real need to pay attention to things people really value that can't always be counted and that are often very fragile. We've talked, David's mentioned, cultural practices and community, sense of community. There's also a range of really significant gendered rights and challenges that play out in a loss and damage space and in the context of mobility. And then, other particular communities and issues that are very special to particular people in particular places that we need to lift up and that I think we will be able to lift up through this work and through the advocacy and the conversations and the funding agenda that can come from it. So that's a quick kickoff from me, and I'd love to hear from Celeste too.
Yes, please. I'll just hand over straight to Celeste.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you, David. It's been sort of nostalgic actually to look back in time and to see how UUSC and CJRF first became partners, and to look at all this amazing work that David and his team have been able to put together. So it's really been an awesome journey. I think that some of the key themes that really stood out for me as David was sharing some of the key results of this work is just the importance of understanding how community partners, CJRF's community partners, have been given the freedom and the respect to really design strategies to respond to this enormous issue based on their local context. I think that in itself really lives into the human rights and climate justice lens that Heather mentioned, because it really encompasses, the wide range of socioeconomic and political landscapes that communities are experiencing on the ground that we often sometimes forget in our work. Particularly when you're focusing on thematic issues such as climate, or when you're focusing on other themes that seem to be very siloed in a policy space. So that's the first thing, and that really necessitates this idea that one size does not fit all, and that funders should be responding in that way, that it's very context-based. It requires, all of the recommendations that David mentioned, with flexibility, greater understanding of local contexts, multiple year funding, and funding that does not become a burden to partners, but that instead becomes a much needed resource. I think, secondly, it's really interesting to see the spectrum of responses to this issue of climate mobility, from dealing with displacement itself as it happens to a more anticipatory approach. And then, of course, also responding to displacement itself as it happens, and the negative impacts that comes with that, as David has mentioned. And I think this also recognizes the need for different strategies. And as we saw, CJRF really supported various strategies, from adaptation to training to microfinancing, which has been developed by partners through a participatory and locally led approach. And the recognition that trauma exists, and I think that's human nature, right? But that our responses as funders, as advocates and activists and researchers in this space is to respond through a trauma-informed approach. And that's not something that is shared, but something that is learned. And I think CJRF really practices that in a very sensitive way. And that's something that we should also learn from. And as Heather mentioned, highlighting the intersection with loss and damage. I think there's a lot of conversations that really try and connect. It's more of an intellectual conversation in my mind, a theoretical one that tries to, where does loss and damage fit in climate mobility? And I think that's also important, but I think what David highlighted is just how the disconnect is between how the discourse is happening at the international level, but also what's happening and how it's discussed at the local level. And I think we should be really mindful of this in our advocacy. And I'm talking because I'm the director of advocacy here, focusing on advocacy, because we have the power to really shift and shape processes and mechanisms at the global level, particularly around funding. We don't want the fund to unintentionally leave communities out because of semantics and framing, and I think that's really important for us. But also sharing community narratives is really critical. And I think this is one way for CJRF to do that, is just to share the different types of strategies and responses and how these are developed. And, focusing on the nuances in a space that doesn't always allow or know how to do that is a really important skill for advocates to live into. But I'll stop there and pass it over to Max.
Thank you, Celsius. Thanks a lot. There you said a lot of also interesting things in addition to Heather that we can pick up on. But before that, I'd like to welcome Max Neal, who's program manager at the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium. I understand you're currently traveling in Northern Alaska, so I'm glad you could join us. If you'd like to also share any opening thoughts on some of the things that have been mentioned so far, please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, in reviewing the report, I just want to mention one thing that I don't think is captured in the report, just due to the kind of time period that you looked at and the information that you have available, which is just the existence value of the CJRF, and that I think it's extremely valuable, and that some of the long-term impacts of some of the investments, I think, are very large and help to move the needle in ways that are very difficult to capture in a report like this, where you're taking a snapshot in time with a sample of award recipients. And I can speak to kind of our experience in Alaska. CJRF came in and made, an investment in a couple organizations in Alaska. And I would say they were moderately successful at the time, but they've led to very good long-term outcomes. So I'd just like to very briefly share kind of a story of that. We started with this $300,000 grant from CJRF, and it really helped us to figure out what we should be doing to support frontline communities with relocation and all of that support. So initially, 7 years ago, we just had a few staff, and it's the investments that CJRF have made have helped us figure out what to do, both in terms of the technical assistance and the advocacy, and that has helped us then access much more funding from other organizations. So now this year we're receiving $80 million. Our organization is to create like 60 jobs across the entire state, and our team will grow to 30 people, engineers, planners. So it's these long-term outcomes that I think are difficult to capture in a report like this, but I've seen firsthand the impact of their investments, and I'm very grateful for the existence of organizations like CJRF. So that's my main top line takeaway from the report, in reflecting on the report. So thanks for letting me share that.
Wonderful. Well, while you're still speaking, I think I'll follow up directly with you and ask maybe a little bit. I think in my conversation with your colleague, Jackie Schaefer, who we interviewed for this report, a lot of the work that was talked about and you mentioned is really in sort of, you said figuring things out, right? That was sort of what the grants were for that CJRF proposed. And maybe can you tell us a little bit more about that, and also how that transition happens to maybe some of the much sort of bigger scale work that you're now engaging in, and also how the sort of capacity building element plays into that, which you also mentioned.
Sure. So two key themes that you just mentioned are technical assistance to support communities and then the advocacy. So in terms of figuring things out on the technical assistance side, like the US government does not have a program to support communities to relocate. So we've had to figure out how we approach that. We, as a tribal organization in Alaska and a network of tribal organizations and the government. So we started with funding for one position from CJRF, and we basically learned that that was not the right approach, that we need a much, much larger interdisciplinary team of scientists, planners, engineers, grants professionals, et cetera. And we want that to be regionally based in different Alaska regions. So Alaska is a fifth of the size of the entire United States. It's huge. So kind of the vision is to build out teams in different regions to support communities and have some backstop support from the statewide level. So that was really helpful to basically to make mistakes and to fail, and to have the flexibility of CJRF to be like, okay, well, you failed, but now we'll let you pivot to advocacy. So we kind of rescoped our project midway to focus on advocacy and increase community engagement on some national policy recommendations. And that report has had a lot of impact. It's built capacity within our momentum, within our organization, to hire new positions, like a director level position who you spoke with. And then, our team convened 120 communities and federal decision makers earlier this year on the report. And that, that's not paid for by Climate Justice Resilience Fund. It's now we're getting funding from others. But it was a catalyst for all of this learning and increased access to resource.
Wonderful. I'm glad you could join us to share that. And I want to connect it to something that Salote said about, maybe they're not connected, but Salote, you said it's important to really ensure that funding doesn't become a burden. And I'd be curious to hear what you meant by that. And I wonder if it connects at all to ensuring, like helping ensure that these transitions are done in ways that are sustainable. Is that what you had in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think, just based on what we've heard from our own partners, that organizations with reduced capacity, and it's really great that ANTHC has been able to build this capacity within the organization. They really don't have time to be applying to funds and compiling long reports. Because that takes up a lot of their staff's time. They often spend most of their times fundraising. And so that in itself becomes a burden, because they won't be able to have the capacity to actually implement projects on the ground, which requires a lot of time in itself. And rather spends a lot of their capacity to be compiling these reports and building that fundraising capacity. So that's what I really meant, and it's based on feedback that we've gotten from partners directly. But I think that, providing resources to actually help build this capacity while minimizing is what CJRF has been able to model exceptionally well. I think that's what is needed, philanthropy as a whole.
And maybe staying with you, just since we're on this topic, I know that USC, a lot of the work, especially some of the more recent grants as well, are really about re-granting to small community-based organizations. Could you just say a few words about the role, I guess, you play in helping them cope with some of these questions that these issues that you've just raised?
Yeah, so we've been able to leverage CJRF's support to provide direct funding to a number of partners in the Pacific. Most of our partners are small community grassroots groups. Some of them are registered, some of them are not registered. And so they haven't been able to access, large funds or even funds that are meant for non-government organizations because of this. So we've been able to use our access to re-grant some of these funds and manage some of the risks around that through this re-granting process. And really fortunate to work with CJRF, who's been able to take a lot of those risks directly re-granting to organizations at the local community level sort of has taught us a lot about some of the challenges that they have to go through. It's not just capacity, it's meeting some of the government laws and policies, being able to navigate that through re-granting, but also minimizing some of the reporting requirements and really stepping into that space where we're able to like really go out there and understand the context, but also do this reporting ourselves to CJRF. And that's really allowed our partners the space, the resources, and the time to focus on the substantive work, to build community organizing, to really focus on the issue at hand. And so it's been challenging, I will admit that, but it's really living into, climate justice and human rights lens where we, fulfill our end of the responsibility. We're not just allowing them to have direct access to funds, but to also reduce the capacity burdens that they have.
Great, thanks. I wonder, Heather, if you have any reactions to these two contributions from Max and Salote. And then after you've spoken, I'd like just so you're prepared, we'll maybe recenter the conversation a little bit on the specifics to do with more of the relocation, migration, displacement aspects of the projects and what specific challenges arose from that. But Heather, if you have any reactions.
Yeah, I guess two thoughts. First, following on Salote's comment about regranting, there's a lot of misunderstandings about regranting, I think, in philanthropy, and there's this desire in many cases for a very direct relationship between the funder and the ultimate user of the funding. And in many cases, that's important and helpful and empowering. And in other cases, it is, it's a little counterintuitive, but we are able to move more money much more quickly and much more locally through the partnership with UUSC than I think either of us would be able to do on our own. And that kind of trusted partnership that we trust UUSC, they have a community of partners who they trust and who trust each other and who are now jointly deploying this funding across the Pacific in ways that, I couldn't imagine because I'm not there on the ground. And which certainly if we were to do it by ourselves at CJRF, we'd be still back at the very beginning of it, whereas they're able to just get going. So that's one thing I wanted to flag here that people don't necessarily think about in this space. In terms of, Max's comment, I want to say thank you to Max for being upfront about some of the failures and challenges at the outset of the work they were trying to do with our support. And those ups and downs are something that, maybe they didn't quite get captured by this evaluation, but they're getting captured in this webinar. So thank you. This kind of reality of what it takes to do this work is something CJRF has, I think, developed a particular tolerance for and even active interest in. There's a need for flexibility in funding because so much of what's being done is so new. The Arctic is losing its ice and it's losing it very quickly, and this has never happened before, and the consequences are something people haven't had to deal with before. And so the trial and error involved is something funders need to have some respect for and tolerance for. And then in addition to flexibility, I think there's just a reality that we need to start funding on longer timeframes. I think our grant to ANTHC started as a 2-year grant, or maybe it was 3, but either way, it was hilariously short. we now have probably a 5-year relationship, and that grant came through the pandemic. It's come through a lot of ups and downs in a lot of different spaces, and is now having an influence in a way that is actually quite typical for our grants. We are learning that when we're able to stay in partnership over the longer run, we're able to really see an impact that we can't see with just 2-year grants. So those are some quick responses there, David. And yeah,
thank you.
Back to you.
Yeah, great. I'll just a quick point to our listeners. I noticed there's maybe one question in the Q&A. I also saw some going through the chat, but there's been quite a lot. So if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A so that it comes to my attention. And to the one that's already been posed, we will happily share the slides with you. Yes. So my question now, back to Max and Charlotte, I guess. Really, the focus of the report was intended to look at the part of the CJRF grant portfolio that had components of the work that were really focused on assisting communities facing some form of climate mobility, as I've called it, but essentially migration, a displacement, or a relocation process. Could you maybe reflect a little bit on some of the, in the context in which you work, some of the challenges that are specific to that aspect? Because of course, your organizations also do all sorts of other adaptation and resilience work. But is there something specific about relocation or displacement that required particular measures, new activities? Let's start with Max, maybe, or whoever is ready first.
I'm ready.
All right.
So I think 2 challenges are on the policy side for, how we believe that the government should invest in communities to keep them safe in terms of relocation, that the federal government should pay for that. And the challenge is how do they do that? How do they allocate these national resources and services to meet community needs? And all those decisions are made in Washington, D.C., and typical programs don't reflect the on-the-ground needs in rural Alaska, where there's communities of 200 people, and there's maybe 1 or 2 people that run all the administrative functions of the community. So huge challenge there is in terms of changing how the federal government invests in the work. And that is enormous amount of communication and advocacy. So that has been a #1 challenge. And, now our organization's 7 years into this, and it's going to take another maybe 10 years for congressional legislation. I don't know how long it's going to take, but folks, there's momentum, and it's going to happen eventually. Another challenge is on the technical assistance side is meeting communities where they're at. Small community of 200 doesn't have a full-time planning and engineering and public works department to move an entire community. So kind of creating capacity elsewhere and sharing that with communities, that is a really big challenge too. So yeah, those are the first 2 things that come to mind.
Yeah, great. Charlotte, do you have your own answer to this question?
I think, there are 3 things that come to mind. One is, when we've really first started working on this issue of climate force displacement, that is sort of the portfolio of our work that we've collaborated with closely with CJRF. There were 3 things. One that Heather already mentioned is just the lack of funding that's very dedicated to this issue. So we had to work sort of like start from scratch, really, about working with partners or identifying partners that was focusing on this issue of climate mobility, but also working within a space that was very new, that was had a dearth of funding resources, didn't have any resources at all, actually. The second thing is just working within a space that doesn't have much governance around this issue. You know, there was just no governance framework at all in the Pacific about how to go about addressing this issue. There was no policy frameworks. There wasn't even any government agencies that were looking at this issue of climate mobility in a region that's very isolated geographically, but it's often very remote from global processes. So while there were some discussions happening at the global level, at the regional level and at the local context in some of the countries that we were working in, there was just no governance framework at all. So that made it even more challenging. How do we advance climate justice on this issue of climate mobility in a space that does not have any overarching governance frameworks? And I think the third is similarly to what Max mentioned, is working with communities who have dealt with displacement at one time in their history. Some of them were actually related to environmental displacement, environmental migration. They were forced to leave their communities due to the destruction of their communities by mining corporations that were supported by other governments at that time. Those that had been forced to move because of natural disasters. So this was not the first time that they were looking at the issue or anticipating displacement because of a future climate event. They had already experienced it. And there was trauma that was, and I keep on bringing this up, there's trauma that's already been experienced. And there was no, they were just forced to relocate at some point in time. So those are three things that are unique to this issue that's not really experienced by other communities that are dealing with other issues, climate issues.
Great, thanks a lot. I just wanted to check in. Actually, we're reaching almost an hour, but we have plans to go a little bit over. I hope that's fine with more scheduled closer to 75 minutes. So we're in for a little bit more time. I hope that's fine. And I want to pick up maybe on a couple of things that were just said, and then also make sure that we cover some of the questions that came in. Something that I picked up on, and that was in common from both Max and Salote, and I think is part of what CJRF is doing, is this idea of movement building, or at least the sharing or the pooling of experience and resources at regional levels. So I think in Alaska, that's what you're doing, right? So no individual community can do the work on its own, and it requires some sort of regional support and exchange. And similarly, Salote, you've been involved in the organization of convenings or meetings of communities, both regionally in the Pacific, but also an international one that was organized in Anchorage, Alaska in 2018, bringing communities from very different parts of the world. And so I'd be interested in brief sort of reflections on this from all of you. You've already touched on some of these aspects, but is basically the contention that this sort of sharing of experiences and bringing of people together, the way to also achieve some of those scale issues that you're facing. Maybe Max?
Well, let me share a brief story, which is so we need to change, like we need to create new federal legislation in order to solve the problems here in Alaska. And some lower 48 tribes with their very fancy attorneys have advanced some legislation that is really designed for the lower 48. It doesn't meet the needs in Alaska. So, this overall question of movement building is like, who has the power? Well, in this case, they have the power and resources, and they've advanced this. They've come to Alaska tribal organizations to seek support. And 7 years ago, if this had happened, it would have moved forward probably. But now there's teams, and there is more of a network here to say, oh, no, this doesn't meet our needs. It doesn't work for the remote communities in Alaska. So this is something that happened recently, and it kind of like put a pause on it a little bit. It's not resolved, but I think it's just critical to like the investment that CJRF made here helped, get us to where we are today, to where it's like, oh, actually we have a bit of power too. We, like Alaska Tribal Orgs, not me as personally. So it's a great success, and it's just so important. It's like, who has that power? So yeah, I just wanted to share that little story as an example of moving the needle a little bit, and that it takes so long to build that movement. And when Heather was in Alaska in 2018, we were talking about a coalition. Well, now there's more of a coalition here, but it's still not what you might envision as a amazing, thriving coalition, but it's closer to that.
Great, yeah, thanks. I think that illustrates it really well. And I'll hand to Charlotte and then to Heather to reflect on this.
Yeah, thank you for that question, David. We've been able to facilitate and put together 3 meetings or convenings or gatherings. We use that term interchangeably with CJRF throughout the years. The first one was in 2018, and it was titled The First People's Convening on Climate Force Displacement, and it was in Alaska. And it was actually the first time that we brought together partners from Alaska, Louisiana, and the Pacific Islands to meet to talk about this issue of climate force displacement and how it was affecting them as individual communities, but also collectively as a whole. And then in 2022, where we convened our partners in the Pacific, and then again, we just did it in June. I think convening as a tool is a really powerful way to support communities through a climate justice and human rights lens. It's not just about the meeting and the few days that you have those meetings. It's powerful because they are the ones that actually inform the agenda. They are the ones that co-design the meeting. So their intentions are met rather than ours. We're sort of outside as facilitators and conveners of this space. But I always describe these meetings as magical and powerful because we actually get to hear from communities about their interests, about how their rights are being met and not met, about the issues that they're facing at the community level, individually, but also how they share these experiences. We would never know that until 2018 that some of the feelings that communities were feeling in Alaska, it was shared with folks in the Pacific, and that they had, in fact, been exchanging information long before we stepped into the pictures. So, it's really a powerful space where you actually get to practice human rights-based approaches, where you help support communities to meet their right to self-determination, their right to access information, their right to know information that will help them in their decision-making, but also, their rights under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and to connect on a human level. And I think that has been able to transcend, the impact of that has been able to transcend over time and geographical space. And I think it's one of the most effective tools that we as supporters and allies and funders can help communities meet their rights and understand what their rights are together and individually as well.
Thank you, Charlotte. Heather, perhaps you could share also your thoughts on what some of the impact of such meetings have on an organization like CJRF and participating and convening them. Like maybe there's also some things that you draw from these sorts of events. And then there's also a question in the chat for you that I'll direct to you afterwards.
Sure. Well, Charlotte mentioned this point around connection and how powerful that can be for movements. And it's always a little bit tricky for funders to understand what is our role in that connection. And, usually there's an organic development of connectivity amongst players who benefit from that connectivity. And ideally, a funder would be in a position of supporting that as it's growing. but sometimes it's hard to know where that is. Sometimes it doesn't seem to be happening, and funders want to prompt it, and sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And I think I have found that it's most useful for an organization like CJRF to be in listening mode as much as possible and to be responsive to the kinds of connectivity that movement actors themselves are building and are interested in building, rather than coming from the outside and proposing specific connections that may not be a fit. We have had some unique opportunities around connection and around learning across geographies and across dimensions that maybe very few others are in position to help facilitate. And our website, there's a learning section of our website that includes some of the blogs that we've done around some of these areas of learning. And then also some of the webinars that we've done where we gave space to our partners to share what they wanted to share with each other, sometimes on a particular theme, sometimes just coming out of a particular body of work. And I welcome everyone to take a look at that. I think it'll be a long time before we know whether that's had a direct impact on movements. I can certainly, point to certain connections that I know wouldn't happen without CJRF. But I think it's easier to point to shifts in movements where our role has been more nuanced. For example, over the last 3 or 4 years, our partners in Bangladesh have increasingly been part of a civil society coalition that has been increasingly savvy, increasingly cohesive, increasingly impactful with their own national advocacy and with sharing Bangladesh's experience on relocation and displacement and loss and damage globally. And I think the power of that coalition is not something CJRF's invested in directly, but the examples, the experiences, the voices from the work that we have supported in Bangladesh are coming into that. And there's some of the many strengths that are coming together in that coalition, which I think was very important to the creation of the Loss and Damage Fund at the global level, for example, and to other wins, both nationally and internationally for Bangladesh. In terms of the question in the chat around the locally led adaptation principles, a number of our partners and myself as well were pretty instrumental in contributing to the development of those principles and giving feedback to them and endorsing them and helping them build momentum, which maybe has slowed a little bit in the last year or two, but this set of principles has endorsements from, I don't know, probably close to 100 different entities, including a number of important development funders, including a number of global development players, and a range of institutions that really matter for climate change action at the global level and climate finance. And I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but that we are seeing more and more attention to the power of local leadership in climate work and the need for support for local leadership. 2 things I guess I would want to draw attention to that are inherent in those principles and are especially important when it comes to the mobility agenda. One is the concept of self-determination. And I actually am forgetting now whether this gets an explicit shout out in the principles. Maybe Aisha or someone else on the call can put a link to these principles in the chat. I seem to only have access to chats with my fellow panelists. But this idea of self-determination is really important and really powerful when we're talking about mobility. As much as possible, we want to find ways to support people to make their own choices, and to support communities to make their own choices, and to put in place systems that avoid forced displacement, because outcomes are much, much better when people choose their own way forward. There is very little experience with self-determined relocation. There's a couple places in Alaska we've seen it. There's a couple a couple of household level initiatives that we've been supporting. But more and more, the world is going to need to find ways for communities to choose their own way forward around relocation. And this is something we need to continue to support and pioneer and figure out how it's done, because it's not easy, and it's really important. For individual migration decisions, the same thing holds true. People need to be able to make choices. Positive, affirming migration, that where people are moving for reasons where they're moving towards something they really want to be part of. They just succeed more than in cases where people are forced to migrate. And so this is one of the things that I think relates to those principles, but is quite particular to mobility. The other thing to keep in mind too is the intersectional nature of these issues, and that women experience climate mobility differently than men. Girls and boys, young people, they have unique needs, unique vulnerabilities in the relocation context. This whole issue of trauma is really important to bring to this reality that different people come at these challenges differently because of gender, because of age, because of their past experiences, because of their community's past experiences or their family's past experiences, and because of their role in society and the expectations of society. So these intersectional issues are another thing I'd like to lift up. And again, they may not be as explicit in those LLA principles as they could be, but they're there, and it's really important to bring that to this mobility agenda.
Yeah, great. Thanks for bringing them up. And I think there's a number of issues we won't have time to dig into fully. I know there were other topics. Maybe we can spend a couple of minutes talking also about a little bit of that trauma-informed approach that Charlotte mentioned, and the loss and damage things. I'm going to suggest that we slowly wrap up, and for that, we'll have, I think, Heather, your two statements almost on the level of takeaway messages. So I want to also give a chance to Max and to Charlotte to similarly share whatever they really think are some of the more important takeaways from our conversation today. But just before we do that, I think there's one question in the chat that was more about, it was specifically about pastoralists in Kenya and their experience of having livelihoods changed by migration. But so perhaps we can't have a conversation about that specific context, because that's not what you're experts on and where you work. But the question draws us very specific link to loss and damage, and I think we can also return to that a little bit now to also conclude on that topic. Could maybe, I think Charlotte, you were the one to talk about that also quite a lot. Maybe just give us some final reflections on this link with loss and damage. And we had a conversation this morning also in the first webinar about the value or not of really thinking of these questions of migration and displacement in terms of loss and damage. And it would be great to hear from you what you think about this development of now framing these questions in terms of loss and damage.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think that we've sort of been challenged by this as well, whether because it started off as climate force displacement, which is our primary portfolio, and then sort of moving into a policy space where there are no gains, really no tangible gains when we talk about this, but reframing it as non-economic loss and damage, and loss and damage in general has been able to garner more traction. So I think from a tactical level, when we are doing policy advocacy, I think there's no real issue that we found at the community level. They've told us, do what you need to do to make it tractionable. But I think there's questions and concerns about ethics and authenticity when we do that, because we are changing the narrative, as I mentioned before, about how communities are experiencing issues at the local level. But then there's differentiation between non-economic and economic loss and damage that we're now having to navigate at the local level, because that is not even that's not the lens at which they look at it, particularly from the Pacific. So I think it's more nuanced than whether it's beneficial or not. I think we always try to live authentically and try to tell the narratives of our partners in a way that really reflects their situation. And I think it's really not helpful when we do that differentiation at the policy level. It's not, as I mentioned, living true to the principles of climate justice and human rights. And at the same time, we're working within a system that's not designed for communities. So we're both challenging it and also trying to reflect how communities are indeed experiencing this. They've experienced it before the terms were made up at the policy level or informed at the policy level. But there's also sort of a moment of celebration, because in the Pacific, we've often looked at it as sort of the underdogs, as having no access to these international spaces. But when we really dig deep into some of these policies, they were in fact initiated by Pacific leaders at some point in time, right? And so there's that moment of recognition. We're challenging the narratives and trying to push the community narratives in its place. And we're trying to work with what is being offered. And so I think it's a sensitive space to navigate. But as Max and Heather and even you have mentioned, there's trust that needs to be built before we start playing around with semantics and language, because it does have policy implications. If not now, on the communities that we work with, it will definitely have implications for future folks that'll come later.
Yeah, to be careful about. I'll maybe ask Max. We'll start wrapping up now. If you have a final takeaway message, reflection on our conversation, over to you.
Sure. So Heather, I think in the beginning, she mentioned that there's more interest in this space of philanthropy and climate justice. And I just want to say that I think that this report and this webinar is important. It's super, super valuable that we all learn from each other. And I hope that as other organizations are interested in climate justice, that they're able to learn from these lessons from CJRF, so that we in the siloed approach, we just repeat the same mistakes. So I'm just grateful for the existence of the report and just continued efforts to capture lessons learned, so that we can, basically, so CJRF can kind of expand that circle of influence to move this area faster, because we need more investments like this much faster. So just so some gratitude for this space. Thanks.
Thank you, Max. Thanks so much. And so I'll just say now to our attendees, we'll share the report with you as soon as it's ready in the next 2-3 weeks, probably in early August, as we make a few final modifications to it. But we have all your email addresses from your registration. I can also obviously share my slides as well, as I see that's been a question a couple of times, and the recording of the webinar. I guess, Salote, I didn't give you a chance to. If there's also a final message you'd like to share, please go ahead, and then Heather, maybe we'll have also a last word and we'll close.
I just want to appreciate everyone for the questions and for the chats, and just appreciate David as well for your facilitation. But I think, this process of reflecting on CJRF's work, I think that takes a lot of courage. It's not always easy to reflect and learn where you made mistakes and what you could do better. But I think as a funder, but I think overall, this issue is still an emerging issue for a lot of communities that we work with. Being able to self-reflect and understand lessons learned, but also move forward with implementing some of these shifts and changes that need to happen is a really important practice. So I encourage everyone, wherever you are, within philanthropy, whether you're a practitioner at the local level, to really adopt some of these practices. We know that we'd all benefit as a movement when we do this. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much. Heather, I'll leave you a last word, and also maybe if you want to say anything about how to get in touch with CJRF more generally and follow the work you do.
Yeah, and I want to, just let people know CJRF is really committed to this learning process and to being a learning organization, and to recognizing how important it is that all of us working on these issues come together to share what we're learning. So over the next few weeks, we're very committed to transparency. We are happy to share the slides from this presentation and also the recording. We also will have the report available, and it will be on our website. And I'm hoping all of you are signed up for our newsletter. I'm sure that will be one space where you can see when the report's finalized and available for all of you to read. We have other activities coming up. We are in the process right now of finalizing a global open call for proposals that is generating a very unique participatory grant-making process. And then we have some regional work that's coming up. So I know there's been some questions specifically around work in Kenya and elsewhere in East Africa. And stay tuned. We will update folks when we have news on that work. I want to thank all of our partners who are here today. CJRF couldn't do anything without our grant partners. We would be meaningless without all of you. There's many other people here I know on the call who I've learned a great deal from over the years, and I want to thank all of you. Particularly, I'd like to thank Aisha Dinsha for shepherding this work and for working closely with David and his team. There's a number of members of the steering committee who are here today. I believe Claire Polking is here, and probably others who I'm unaware of. Thank you very much for your engagement in this and for your feedback and guidance as we've moved forward with this report. And David, thank you for facilitating and for spearheading this effort. I look forward to more conversations about all of these issues and to seeing how we can all move forward together to make sure that that mobility is a way of addressing climate change that can be successful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. That's an excellent way for us to finish today, and you'll hear from us with the results very soon. So goodbye, everyone, and thank you for this excellent conversation today. Bye-bye.